Hi everyone, let's talk today a little bit about value and creating value using some techniques called hatching. So let's do a quick recap about value. That is basically the use of tonal shades to create weight, depth, a sense of light, and to help create a form in the objects that you're drawing. So we're looking at values that go all the way from the brightest white of a highlight into the lighted areas, into a shadow, into the dark core of the shadow, the reflected light and the cast shadow. So these are all the different parts of light and shadows that we're looking at when we're drawing objects using value. Now, so far we've talked about continuous tone value, and we've created this using some of the tools that are good for this kind of practice, which is like graphite or charcoal or Conte crayon, because they create this really nice blended value scale that goes from one end to the other fairly seamlessly. Now we're going to move into a new kind of value that uses a tool like an ink pen where you can't really do any blending. And in that case, in order to create the full value scale, you're going to use a technique called hatching. And here's an example of how to create hatching using an ink pen by creating a series of lines overlapping on top of each other to create the value scale, the same value scale that we've been using all along in our value drawings. Now, this particular one is an example of cross-hatching. So how do you create a value scale using cross-hatching? Here again at the bottom is the example that I showed in the previous slide that goes from all the way from the whitest white of the paper to the blackest black, almost the blackest black you can get with the ink. And the way it basically breaks down is by overlapping lines on top of each other. So you have a series of lines at number 1 that go in one direction, and then you overlap number 2 that cross over in the other direction, number 3 again in a third direction, number 4. So it's just layering and layering lines on top of each other until you get those different tones within the value scale. Now, the ones that we've looked at so far really employ this one type of hatching technique, the one right here in the center called cross-hatching, where you're crisscrossing lines on top of each other in order to create all of those tones. There are a few other types of hatching techniques. In our class, we're going to focus mostly on these 5. One of them would be this first one, hatching with just straight lines. Basically, it's just meaning creating a series of lines that as they get closer together, they get darker. So the denser the lines, the darker the value will be. The next one to it is contour hatching, and this is where you follow the contour of the shape of the object that you're drawing. Just like we did with our cross contour lines, you would just be very specific about how you use the cross contour lines to go beyond just defining the shape of the object, but to also create a sense of light as well. And then let's skip over to this side. We've got stippling. This is using a series of dots. So it really changes depending on the size of the tool, the ink pen that you're using. But what you would do is just to create these dots. And the closer the dots get, the denser the dots are, the darker the value is. And then this very last one is called scumbling. It's basically like creating a bunch of scribbles on a page. This is kind of a fun way of creating value. And the tighter your scribble marks, the darker your value is. And you would use these values and these hatching techniques, to create those tones in a lot of the shapes that we've worked on in class before, to create a sphere, to create a geometric shape like a cube. But just keep in mind that you can really sort of mix some of these different types of techniques together, and it really affects the finished drawing depending on how you choose to create your value lines or to create your hatching lines. So here in this example, on one side, you've got predominantly straight up and down vertical lines with a little bit of cross hatching to create this drawing. And then on the other side, on the right, you have the same drawing, but basically the lines are working with the contour of the shape of the object. So you can draw the same thing using several different techniques, and you'll get different effects from that. Here's one example of how you can use hatching lines. This one is mostly the cross-hatching lines to create a pretty organic shape, Pretty nice form, defining where the light is falling. In this case, it's right here in the center of the apple, a little bit above. And as it gets darker across the back, you see the lines get tighter and finer and denser. Here is an example of where you have really dense lines condensed to create the shape of this object. And in this case, especially along the dark side, you've got a lot of lines overlapping each other. So it's another example of cross-hatching. And then up here, we've got these contour lines that are defining both the shape of that curve of the cylinder as well as defining the light of it. So as it goes across to this side, it gets darker with some cross-hatching here to show that shadow that falls across that side of the cylinder. I do want to point out what's really nice about this drawing is that we have such a strong sense of light hitting the side of the cylinder, and as it goes around, it gets much darker. So you can see that really changing in a pretty fluid way across the shape of the form. And then here we have the shadow that is also just a single tonal value that's really nice and flat using just hatching lines that go in one direction. That helps to create that sense of the flatness of that cast shadow. Pretty expressive way of using hatching and cross-hatching. Again, just simple lines, hatching lines for the shadow, where it gets a little bit more loose with cross-hatching and some contour hatching within the shapes of the fruit. Oh, I wanted to include this slide because I wanted to point out that in our case, in our class, we're going to be using ink pens to create these hatching studies and the hatching drawing, but it doesn't necessarily have to be an ink pen. You could use this technique with any tool. It's really just for the effect of those lines. So this would be graphite. Now let's look at a couple of different of these kinds of techniques in use. So we're going to look at some of the similar objects that we've drawn in class for other exercises. And here we have like the egg shapes created with stippling. I do want to mention that stippling is one of the techniques that take a long time. You have to really slow down and take your time with it. And what happens is the effect is really very dramatic because you can see very fine details with these stippling marks. And there's like a softness quality to stipple drawing. We'll be working with drawing some geometric kind of shapes and some spheres and some softer forms as well. I like how strong the light is falling on the surface of this rectangular box. And here we have a more dense drawing with a lot more dense lines. And there's a little bit of a looseness to this that I really appreciate, where you don't have to necessarily follow any sort of prescribed vertical and horizontal lines, but you can just sort of let yourself feel your way through it intuitively by putting lines down. In that same way, it can create a very soft and organic kind of image. It doesn't necessarily have to be harsh just because it's created with a bunch of lines. Now, this person has decided to really put a lot of lines in to create a much darker image, but in that way, the light parts really pop out. So you'll notice that you've got the shine of these canisters really standing out a lot against the darker tones of the rest of the image, including the darkness of the background, the negative space. Now in this drawing, they've also created a very dark drawing. It's very dramatic, and they've put most of the darkness in the shadows of the objects themselves with a lot of lightness in the background. I think this person has done a really great job of breaking up the negative space with this strong diagonal through the image. And we have this very dark top half and a very light bottom half, the support that's holding these objects. And it creates just a really dramatic effect. The light is just hitting all of these objects in such a way that it has a brightness to it, even though there's so much darkness in this drawing. Oh, so I wanted to bring up a couple of examples here, and this one in the next few slides. Examples of not necessarily having to rely on the cross-hatching method where you crisscross the lines on top of each other, but just the hatching method, which has a really nice effect in itself, where all of the lines are really just going in one direction, but even within those constraints, you can create some soft roundness in the cylindrical objects, and you can create a lot of variety in your tonal values. So a couple more examples of how these lines going in a single direction can be very effective in creating a dramatic image. I just love the energy in these lines too, a real boldness to the way this person really put the lines down and with a lot of determination. Again, another example of very thoughtful composition with a balance of positive and negative space. This can be a little bit hard to do with this kind of technique because it does take a lot of time. So you have to be thoughtful about it and try not to rush it too much, and take your time adding the values that need to be where they are without ignoring, especially without ignoring that background negative space. So I just wanted to point out too that with these techniques you can still work with very organic shapes, like even a person's nose. It doesn't have to be geometric or cylindrical objects. And you can create especially very soft organic shapes, especially with a stippling effect. And it kind of has a very ethereal quality too. It has a lot of personality when you have stippling as your primary hatching method. A nice way to do some sketches and create some really strong effects with sketches. Defining the shapes of drapery can be done as well with hatching. And then I just love the power in these images, how it's like it shows a lot of strength, not only in the image itself, but just the way the lines that are put down with a lot of boldness. And I want to point out that this person has added a little bit of the white conte, or it might be white paint, to bring out the whiteness of the light hitting the knuckles right here. So it's kind of a combination of our project working with Conte Crayon on toned paper and hatching. And that wraps it up for this slideshow, and we'll move on to some exercises and some drawings using these hatching techniques.